Okay, welcome to our last two talks. It's Carl and Elise that probably is finishing something. Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce Carl Hoefer from the Universidad de Barcelona. Many thanks again, Carl, for being here. It's great for us. Well, the title of the talk is Freedom from the Inside Out Revisited. So,
thank you, Christian, and thanks also Olympia for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here for the first time in South America and especially in Buenos Aires. So, and it's been a wonderful conference up till now. So when I was invited to participate in this, I don't work on anything directly related these days to the asymmetry of time and things like that. I was scratching my head for a while, but then I remembered this old paper that I had published in 2002, which has to do with the issues that we are talking about to some extent. And I also remembered that I've changed my mind about something rather important to that paper, and so it's worth the exercise to go back and see if I can fix the thesis of the paper in light of what's happened since. So, as I said, this paper called Freedom from the Inside Out, which I'll abbreviate FFIO, is a way of responding to the argument that if there's deterministic physics in our world, then we can't have free action. And it was based on thinking of time in the usual way of block universe, the sort of B theory, static, eternalist type of view of time. But now, for better or worse, I don't believe in that anymore. And I've, in my old age, come to believe that time actually passes, and in a serious way, not just in the sense that we think it passes or we feel it passes. And so that raises the question of whether the argument I was making in the previous paper just falls apart, or if it can be saved, how could I do that? So that's roughly what I'll be doing today. In just a little more detail, I'll talk first about some standard philosophy of physics dogmas, which I think everybody in the room except me.
That's a bold project.
Well, we'll see. I'll explain what I did in that paper. I'll very briefly explain how I like to think of the passage of time, despite what physics seems to teach us about the nature of time. You'll see right away that believing in the passage of time problematizes the argument of my previous paper, and so then I'll look to see if I can see a way out of the problem. So this is the philosopher of physics world. It's basically space, time, everything in it, all at once. Right? When I first made this diagram, you can see it was 2009, if you can read the print. And so that was meant to be the Earth at that time. But, you know, this is supposed to represent the entirety of the history of the universe. A full, complete, four-dimensional space-time determinate in all detail. There's no now or present or anything like that. No movement, qua the picture of the four-dimensional thing. It's just changeless. And of course, it might or might not have a deterministic physics that captures the way events are in this world. And for today's talk, I'll be assuming that there is, in fact, some deterministic physics, which, as a placeholder, you might think of as Bohmian mechanics, just so you don't fall into trying to think about what I'm talking about in Everettian terms, which will probably not make sense. So we'll imagine that we have a physical determinism governing our world. So time is just a dimension, one of the four dimensions in space-time, even if it is a very special one, as Craig Callender tried to show in his book. So here's the package of dogmas that I used to accept. Let's see if they sound familiar. One is physicalism, and that is the idea that everything that exists is just basically physical stuff, matter in motion in space. Maybe the nature of matter isn't so simple as Democritus thought or Newton, but basically that's all there is. And unless he's changed his mind, I know Barry subscribes to physicalism in a pretty strong way. Eternalism, as I was just explaining, the the universe, the totality of what exists, includes the future, and so on. Determinacy, we usually don't even bother thinking or talking about that, but the idea is that what exists physically is completely determinate. There's no ontological gaps or vagueness in the description we would give using perfect physics to what exists. And finally, relativistic physics is incompatible with the old-fashioned past, present, future distinction, at least as a global thing as opposed to a local thing, and with the passage of time in its ordinary common sense form. And lastly, last dogma, is the fixedness of the past, which I think almost everyone has deeply embedded into their worldview. It's the idea that relations of causation, determination, and so on, they flow from earlier events to later events. And in particular, of course, we can't do anything about the past. It is the way it was, and it is completely fixed in that sense. So
those are facts, not dogmas.
they can be both. They could be both. Because you don't have good reason for them, they're dogmas, but they could be facts. So this is the first dogma that, in a sense, I came to question in that 2002 paper. And the one that I'll get to at the end questioning is the determinacy. Okay, but let's go to the issue that I was addressing with that paper, which is the standard objection that we can't be free agents if there's determinism. So for analytic philosophers like me, we often see this first with the so-called consequence argument that Van Inwagen and Genet and others have put forward. Here's one way of thinking about the basic point of it. No one has power over the facts about the past or the facts about the laws of nature. And no one has power over the fact that the facts of the past and the laws of nature entail every fact of the future. That's the determinism. Therefore, no one has power over the facts of the future. And in particular, that means, although you think you might decide to have only one beer tonight, Daniel, no. It's written in the block that you will have 3 beers, and that's what's going to happen.
So don't feel bad about it.
Exactly. But obviously, the way we live our lives, we manifestly seem to be able to act freely. We don't really, we can't really internalize this picture of ourselves being prisoners of physics. So the first step towards breaking out of this conundrum, the way I wanted to put it forward, has to do with one of the heterodoxies, which is kind of like a rejection of the hardest core type of physicalism. And this is something that I came to believe a long time ago, thanks to John Dupre, Nancy Cartwright, and other teachers. It's the idea of what I call downward causation. I think it's called downward causation by other people. But the idea is that, for example, this is a picture of my finger about to type a key press down a key on my laptop. The motions of the atoms in my fingertips are caused by pushes and pulls from nearby atoms. But they're also caused by my intention to type the word that I subsequently poke out on the keyboard. In other words, this is a correct causal attribution for why the atoms in my fingertip are moving the way they are. It has to do with my intentions. And because intentions are some sort of higher level structure in the universe, not the basic physical stuff, if you believe that there is this kind of causation, you can think of it as downward from high ontological level to the basic.
Sorry, but is that above and beyond all the atoms and the pushing of the atoms and the nerves that are pushing your nerve impulses?
No, it's alongside all those.
It's a side description, or it's a description that shortens, in a way, the previous one, but encodes it or not.
No, I wouldn't go along with the last thing you said, Daniel, but it is supposed to be harmoniously coexisting with the physical explanation for the motion of the atoms. It just has to do with the way the other atoms are pushing and pulling them. So famously, a philosopher named Jae-gwon Kim argued that if you believe in this causation, the physical one, this can't be real, this causation. This causal story can't be real. And I reject that perspective by Kim.
But you think causation is real?
Yeah.
Really fundamental?
No.
That makes a big difference, doesn't it?
What? Tell me why later. Yeah. But I do think that, that this story is the story that starts with my intention to type a certain word, is the more illuminating and more important explanatory story.
Sorry, but then one doesn't supervene on the other. I don't understand. It's hard to understand how one could be everything and nevertheless not supervene on the other.
Well, let's wait.
Yeah.
He finished the talk because he's just at the beginning. Probably he's going to say something.
If you object to the very mild things I say, then what then okay. So, in this paper, the insight, if it was one that I had, was that people who are worried about determinism in their lives have this picture in the back of their mind, which really comes from the A-series time and the common sense worldview where there's this fixed past and the future is sort of determined by it only in sort of one direction. But physics, the story of physics, does not push you in that way in any way at all. The physical story is time-symmetric. Determination relations that we get out of physics can go from a slice or a half of the universe upward, or they can go from the top half down. Or what you can do is just take a chunk out of the center of time and explain both the future and the past by that, in the sense of mathematical determination under the physical laws. And once you take that perspective, then you say, so physics isn't forcing me to feel like I'm a hostage to the past. Instead, I could see what I do here in the center of time as having partial constraints, imposing partial constraints on the way the rest of the block can be. The constraints that we impose towards the future, if we're lucky, are macroscopic and visible. Namely, we intentionally do something and we see the effects of what we are doing. And towards the past, they're completely unobservable. Any constraint, we don't have any way to see or get any hold of whatever the constraint is that's placed on the earlier times in the universe by, say, my choosing to raise this hand instead of this hand. But we can nevertheless say that those constraint relations, partial constraint relations, are just as physically allowed as any other kind of determination relation.
But Carl, listen, the past is unobservable indexed to now. The future is also unobservable indexed to now.
But we observe it quickly if it's talking about the near future in the next 10 seconds.
We only observe the past.
What I mean is that if I decide to raise my left hand, I'll soon be able to see that it was successful. That's all. Nothing stronger than that. Okay. So the idea was that human choices place constraints on the facts in both directions in the block. Towards the future, you might say it's let it be the case that there exists some state of my body subvening Carl types a U, if I'm deciding to type the U on the keyboard. And to the past, let it be the case that some state of the world subvenes the macro past as we know it, the macroscopic observable past, and my typing a U now. And that's it. And of course, I don't get to choose what microstate in the world is the one that subvenes. I couldn't care less anyway. But this is the idea. And now a question arises that I tried to deal with in the paper. It's not just Karl on this one occasion, but we'd like to think of all the choices of free agents as being equally free. We'd like to be democratic about it. So can all of the different choices of all the different agents out there in the world mesh together so that all the constraints that these agents are putting on the block can be satisfied all at once? And I tried to argue that, yes, it seems very plausible. There's a lot of microstates, a lot of different configurations. Moreover, essentially, the story that I'm sketching for you here is basically the same story about counterfactuals that Barry was just sketching earlier in his talk, in the sense that, well, I've read the full paper that Barry wrote about free will, and his view is that when you choose to do something, a certain counterfactual is true. If I had chosen to raise my right arm instead of my left, the microhistory of the universe would have been different in unobservable ways that we can't control and that don't matter at all to us. And that's basically the same thing I'm saying, but in his case, he's not putting a lot of strong emphasis on this idea of our controlling or partially determining the state of the world. It's an account about counterfactuals in Barry's treatment. So the idea is that we have divergent futures. The future seems open to us. And we have identical looking pasts that are all different in terms of the microstate, but in terms of what's macroscopically observable, they're basically all the same. And I should say, one of the things that's misleading about this diagram, you've got a lot of things here that are all sort of macroscopically identical looking, and then we see these branches coming out. But really, each of these lines should be a big, thick bundle of branches as well. So, and then there's the actual history that's encoded in the block universe, including the future.
It's like my T-shirt. Oh,
I stole this from Barry's talk. So you see, we should have multiple strands going back, but also the multiplicity should continue here. It actually should continue on every branch. You've got bundles. Okay. So I published this paper in a volume that Craig edited in 2002. It fell into a black hole and nobody talked about it ever again. But then some people stumbled on it later, and Janan Ismail actually is a fellow traveler with me in the sense that in her book, How Physics Makes Us Free, her story is very, very similar to what I was just sketching. And she added a little postscript saying, I just stumbled onto Carl's paper and he said something very similar. And I think that Barry's paper, which I was just mentioning, the consequence argument meets the mentaculus, is again doing something rather similar, but in some ways less radical. So we can compare, there's two ways of thinking about what I proposed in that 2002 paper. A light and a heavy. Now on the light way of reading what I'm talking about here, you can just go to Barry's paper. It's an account about counterfactuals which serves you to defeat the consequence argument as von Inwagen published it. The premise that you're rejecting in von Inwagen's argument is the one that says we have no control over the past, or no influence over the past. And you can reject that because on the story about counterfactuals that Barry develops, it's counterfactually true. If I had raised my right hand instead of my left, the microscopic state of things in the past would have been different. That's a true counterfactual. His story is still compatible with being an extremely strong physicalist, a reductive physicalist even. But it may strike some people as, to borrow Kant's phrase, close to being a wretched subterfuge when it comes to being a satisfying story about your freedom. And in español sería un engaño miserable. That's what Kant labeled David Hume's solution to the free will problem.
I've had students call Kant that.
I don't see it as a wretched subterfuge, but it's true that I think that when I talk about these, the explanatory relations of what happens in the block flowing from human actions and being primary determinants of states of things, Barry wouldn't want to go along with that quite in a strong sense. Well, if you read it in a heavy way, and that's why I started talking about downward causation, taking it seriously, then the universe is the way it is because we exist in it and act freely. Partially. It's the way it is for a lot of other reasons too. But in part, this is part of the story.
Is it just us or animals, plants?
Yeah, I think, yeah. It would include animals and plants. Plants probably don't have intentions the way that animals and we do, but this is not meant to be restrictive to humans, that's for sure.
Carl, just a clarificatory question. When you said double causation, to me it sounds like mental causation because it's from intentions to matter, right? But double causation could be from matter to matter, just a different level, right? I mean,
It doesn't have to have intentions to it.
But you said, I mean, at the beginning you said that it was intention, and then going downward to you pressing the ear, right?
Yeah.
That's your intention.
But that, my intentions
Yeah.
supervene on my brain state, which is
Okay,
physical.
okay.
And so there could be downward causation that geologists talk about where rain
So you don't
causes erosion too.
You don't mean something like mental causation. Okay.
No. Nevertheless, you might still feel it's disturbingly idealistic, the way I'm trying to sell you this. Okay, and just to go back to where I started, I thought that a key to making this a somewhat new way of resolving the problem of freedom and interesting is that it hinges on rejecting the common sense everyday notion of the passage of time and the common sense everyday belief that we go around with that the future's done and the past is being written right now. But years later, well, I've fallen back into that common sense view, and so I'm not so happy with anything that depends on believing in the existence already, as it were, of the future. So I need to come back and look at that. Let's see, I've already spoken for a good while. So I'm not going to say much about why I became apostate from the Church of Eternalism. And I think it's obvious to everyone, you grapple with this and you learn to live with it some way or another, but it's a static metaphor that we get with B-series or the block universe, and it doesn't capture the dynamism of time, the happening and unfolding of events that seems to be so central to the everyday notion of time. I think that when you really, really think about it, it's hard to take seriously the idea that passage is unreal and totally illusory. And I can lean on the fact that Tim Maudlin and John Norton have both written papers saying exactly that and arguing for real passage of time. But then they're not going to reject the block either. So I'm not sure how real their passage of time ends up being, but they say these things too. So instead, at least as a metaphorical picture to use to think about the passage of time, I've always liked the so-called growing block picture where, the world just keeps getting older and what has happened, history, keeps getting bigger. Okay? But we don't have to take this too literally and seriously. Okay, so I'm not going to spend any real time giving you arguments for something that I know will not convince anyone. But basically, if you believe in the block picture, then this could be a universe with all sorts of stuff happening in it. It'll just have one dimension less than our space-time. That doesn't seem like a plausible thing to believe. So I put in my slides a quote from Tim Maudlin's book where he's arguing against Hugh Price. But I can put that up if anybody's interested later. All right. Now, I admit that the passage of time is problematic. That's one of the reasons why early on I decided to go along with people like Craig and think it's just an illusion. It's hard to cash out this talk of passage, flow of time, genuine change, etc. in other terms. Physics doesn't have any need of such talk of the passage of time. And it seems like relativity theory is telling us it's really hard to believe in a privileged now or present for the world, but I still think it's far from clear that physics will in the end force us to reject these notions. The jury is out until we really have a better fundamental physics. Okay, so good. This is all stuff about how I like to think about time. So that you don't take the growing block thing too seriously, the way I think about the world is the only thing I agree with Wittgenstein about, perhaps. Die Welt ist alles, was der Fall ist. The world is everything that's the case. If you sort of say everything that's true, you could list it, that would be what reality is. And of course, now, future events are not on that list. We can't write down, it's not just that we can't, nobody could write down what's the case about the future. Okay, so as I said, this is the way to think about it. These are just facts about the past, and this is the world.
When's it going to grow? When's it going to grow?
Grow up? It's going to grow old like us. Time is, for some purposes, represented well as a line, and history is well represented as a block when you want to idealize and include the future, but those are just representations. Okay, let's move on from that. So, as I said, the key to my 2002 idea was the indifference of explanatory direction that you can argue is present in what physics gives us about the block. And so the idea was, well, just take the whole thing as a whole and assert whatever sort of partial constraint relations you want to assert, starting from the actions of the beings, the free agents inside the block, and go from there. But in a growing block picture or a dynamic picture of time, the direction seems to be built into the phenomenon of passage of time itself. And now we fall back into thinking that insofar as anything produces the next events, it's past and present events. So there's no determination from future towards the past because those things don't exist. Future events, being non-existent, can't have any influence on current or past states of affairs in the intuitive sense of influence. Not even limited partial determination type influence of the kind I was talking of before. Furthermore, if the past is already fully determinate, then we already have the full microstate of events in the past. What about my future choices? The idea of freedom from the inside out was that I can regard all the choices in my life as placing partial constraint relations. But no, if you adopt this growing block type picture, it's there, the future events don't exist. Whatever has determined what the microstate is, it's in the past or right now. So my future free actions can't get a look in. There's nothing left for them to do. And here's a question. Even if you adopt the passage of time perspective, doesn't Barry's story in terms of counterfactuals still go through? I think it does, but I'll let him comment on that if he can. But so it seems like the light version of freedom from the inside out can still be maintained, and Barry's doing that. But the heavy thing is kind of out. So thinking about this and seeing the problem led me to think, if I want to have my future actions as well as my current actions be placing partial constraints on the way the world is, well, then I need the world not to be finished yet in the past. In other words, the idea would be not everything is completely determinate about the past. In other words, forget about bivalence and the total determinacy of what physically exists. Now many of us are comfortable with this bivalence means any statement is either true or false, period. And many of us are comfortable with non-bivalence for statements about ordinary things in the messy world of common sense. For example, Alice loves Bob. That may be neither true nor false. Or it's raining in London at time T. So, no, Bristol maybe, but it's not. In London, it does this thing that gets you wet, but you can't see any raindrops. That's what I'm saying. Okay. So these things could be failing bivalence, but I think that we're inclined to think that if we're talking in the language of final physics, then this proposition, the state of S is P, got to be either true or false. So physical reality, we all assume, is sharp and clear. And that's even true in the Everettian picture. I mean, it's the state is what it is, determinately, as it were. Okay. What if then, this is the crazy idea that I decided to put out as a speculation. What if, in fact, the micro-states about the past are not determinate yet? Could we imagine or somehow defend the idea that events now, including our actions, are constantly refining and defining the past and present as well as shaping the future? And so you could think of this as saying the world is not like a Lewisian possible world, which is the specification of all the properties at all points in space and time, but rather it's a possibility that's undergoing constant refinement. And then it occurred to me, not that this is much of an ally for me, but the standard interpretation of quantum mechanics has always been suggesting something a bit like this, something analogous to this. When the physicists would say that particles have no determinate location or trajectory until measured. Or when Wheeler talked about the delayed choice experiment and he invited a backwards determination reading, a choice that we make after the wave has passed through the slits determines whether it's gone through one particular slit or not. Now I know that's a very optional or perhaps even non-optionally wrong reading of delayed choice experiments. I know that's controversial. I'm just saying that quantum mechanics has already gotten some people into the mood of thinking about reality as sort of lacking sharpness and then gaining some sharpness when some things happen. So, what I'm putting out on the table for refutation here is a Bohmish interpretation about past indeterminacy. The deterministic mechanics offers an infinity of possible microhistories that all have the same observable past in a macroscopic sense, which is to say an infinity of ways for the possibility of our world to get refined by the attrition of some things that are currently open possibilities, which is to say the addition of further determinateness to the past as events unfold over time. Okay, and so you could think of it like this. Here's how things are now, a bit later still. And there's no red line. That's one of the big differences here. We don't pick out a red line as telling the determinate story, because at every point where there's this kind of macroscopic branching, you lose a huge number, probably an infinite number of possibilities for the microstate of the world, and it just keeps on going. So this revised sort of damaged version of freedom from the inside out would be that at all times as world events unfold, agents' choices can be seen as partially constraining what happens in the future and what was the case in the past. Not in any way that gives us control or ability to say anything about the past that we can't already say. And then the full story of history exists only when all is said and done. And now, again, there's a kind of a light way you could read this, which is just assuming it works, assuming I haven't put some tremendous obstacle into the picture. Stick with Barry Lower's account about counterfactuals. Keep your thin red line, which is the determinate story of all of time in the past. And maybe it may feel like even more of a wretched subterfuge, I don't know. But this needs nothing more than philosophical argument to substantiate it. If you take this in the kind of the heavy way that I've been sketching, then we're still taking downward causation seriously. Human choices participate in the actualizing of the world in some important sense. Probably disturbingly idealistic, this picture. And it would be nice if there could be any sort of conceivable evidence that could support this or refute it. I'm not sure if it lends itself to anything empirical at all. Okay, so thanks for listening, and look forward to discussion.
Karim first and David.
That's very interesting. Couldn't we retell the story as an epistemic story rather than a metaphysical?
Yes.
So a lot of the ingredients would be the same. We'd just be learning about determination be just of our knowledge, not of the state of the world. That's it. To me, that then sounds very uncontroversial.
I agree. Giving all of this an epistemological gloss makes it uncontroversial. It also then doesn't particularly help if you're worried about free will.
And they,
if I accept the sort of strong downward causation you're suggesting, I'm wondering why you'd then be pulled to something like Bohm's theory and not just to the quote standard interpretation of quantum mechanics. I mean, the classic objection to that is always that something like measurement is too vague and ill-defined. But normally that's taken as to mean measurement is vague and ill-defined in the language of microscopic physics.
Yeah.
But if one's relaxed about downward causation, one's kind of dropping the priority of the language of microscopic physics anyway, in which case, why worry about the measurement problem?
Good. I think you're right, and I think also that the reason I stuck the idea of Bohmian mechanics in there was just so I could have a background dynamics that I could say is deterministic, whereas the standard interpretation is stochastic in the measurement collapses. Yeah.
If for the sake of the discussion we restrict our consideration to a fully deterministic world, it seems to me that the issue of causation is, in a sense, an issue of choice. Something completely determines, the past completely determines the future completely determines the past, and then we may feel more comfortable psychologically deciding that our actions cause this, but there is no matter of fact as to which one causes anything, and in that sense we would still lose the free will that we were looking for, or wouldn't we?
Yes, I think you take that perspective and you will lose any sense of comfort you might have momentarily had with the perspective I was sketching. And I used to, when I was a young assistant professor, I would say, look, I don't see causation in physics, in the fundamental stuff. It seems like just a human gloss that we put over things and nothing fundamental. And I'm not sure that I want to say that anymore. But I agree that that's another way to view it.
No, perhaps in a non-deterministic world there is an asymmetry like that. But in a deterministic world, I don't see how.
Why does determinism make much of a difference here?
Well, in an indeterministic world, there is the structure can be something like collapse theories, in which from the previous state I have definite rules of what are the options for what can happen later, but from the later state I don't have any sort of rule to what could have been the previous state, except a very limited, of a different kind of rule, the connection from the future of it's something called collapses from here to here, well, the only thing I know of a British state is it must have had a component here, but it could have well been, you know, here, or anything else. There is absolutely no. So there is a clear directionality and then I could say causation is associated with the, you know, more restrictive kind of relationship.
Okay.
But in the one-to-one relationship, I don't see what besides choice we can do to give priority of one or the other.
Yeah. And Balazs, and then Robert.
Just a metaphysical spin on Graham's question. So how much of what you said can be understood as a complaint about mathematical representation? So I have the metaphysical concept of a history of a word, and then we tend to represent it mathematically in physics with a solution of a differential equation. Instead of, can I hear what you are saying, or much of what you are saying is as a complaint that the solution of a differential equation is not the right way to represent the mathematical concept of a history, but it's some sort of bundle of solutions which behave in a certain way. That would be the right metaphysical representation.
I think so. I mean,
because if you do that, I mean, I did some things like that in the past. I don't think you get back the passage of time still.
okay, maybe you can tell me about it in the coffee. Thanks.
So I had in mind something very similar to what went on right before this about causation, but I didn't really understand how how the conversation went. When you brought causation into your talk, it seemed to come in from left field in a certain way, and you know, I always reach for my gun when I hear about causation. So, if one thought that causation itself wasn't fundamental, then I don't see why you seem to be using causation as some sort of a crutch to give a basis for you having this directionality of time and this very heavy way in which you want the future to be open and the past closed. But from the point of view of someone who is a physicalist and a blocked universe person, though not necessarily, the determinacy is a more complicated thing, I think, but that's aside. From that point of view, well, you know, the whole thing is specified, determined by the totality of the block, including what part causes what other part, which part of me causes which other thing that's going on. And
so when you say that everything's determined by the full story in the block, if that's a way of sort of committing to type reductionist stories like Hemo and Schenker insist that we do, then I want to jump off, because I think that the type reductionism just doesn't work. I'm a physicalist, but I'm a what do you call it? A non-reductive physicalist.
So I'm not sure what non-reductive means there either. If types means as we ordinarily type brain states and we only type mental states, of course type reductionism doesn't work. But if you can, if any collection of microstates can count as a type, I don't see any problem with type reduction. So you need some sort of standard about what makes for a type.
Yeah. Well, we shouldn't get into
but I
too
was
much
more
about
interested
that,
in the more metaphysical part where you seem to have a big desire to get freedom in there because you want this openness of the future in there.
Yeah.
And you want the openness in the future in because you think that our concept of causation will somehow require that or something.
No, I guess I want the future, the open future in there because that's the way I think it is. That's all, and I want to have a story to tell about.
That's the way it appears. Right?
And so the downward causation thing is brought in as a kind of a motivator for just thinking, it's not such a strange idea that the motion of an individual atom could be best explained by the intentions of the human that owns the atom, as opposed to best explained always by some...
Best explained and caused, they're different,
I don't know. Maybe you have more in mind for causation than I do. I don't know.
I have much less in mind for it, sure.
Yeah, I used to be a causal skeptic, but it's true that you can't, you really can't be a total causal skeptic, because we talk about causal relations in science and everyday life too much.
So we have to get these counterfactuals.
So I mean, I do think that what gives the oomph to causation in general is laws of nature. That's the way I see it. What gives the modal force to them.
So I see where we differ.
So I'm thinking a little bit about your last bullet point about how to think about evidence here.
About
how to think about evidence here. And I'm sympathetic to the idea that we shouldn't be assuming forms of reductionism and no downward causation and things just as sort of a priori dogmas. However, if I think what the evidence would look like, if I think about living in a world in which irreducible downward causation is all over the place and passage of time is objective, I can imagine living in a world that has a sort of Cartwrightian systematic failure to establish interlevel relations of various kinds, and where time and again, when we try to understand how some higher level system can be analysed in terms of a lower level description, we run into roadblocks and failures. And where our physics and our other higher science often ends up deploying passage ideas inherently, and where our quantum gravity speculations are richly filled with theories that explore that way of doing time. And if I imagine a world that was the other way around, I'd imagine one where actually when we try to analyse high-level systems, while it's hard work, we have a systematically successful project that tends to sooner or later manage to give lower-level analyses of these frameworks, and in which our quantum gravity looks broadly the same kind of dynamical, timeless framework we see in the rest of our physics. I mean, I suppose, does that sound the right way to think about evidence? And secondly, you can see that I think the second of those fits better to where we actually are, but I don't know how much you agree.
Yeah, I think that's a nice way to talk about the kind of evidence that could be relevant. But also, I also had in mind just, you know, if we sort out in a sort of a definitive way that everybody's happy with the measurement problem, and we have quantum mechanics in a no longer mysterious form working for us and things like that, maybe that the physics that we get out of that would totally refute this or somehow support it.
Well, that's why I was partly surprised that you were using the Bohmian framework, because if you force me to make the case for downward causation, I'd probably have the measurement problem as my best example of a genuine roadblock where we run into trouble trying to do a reduction. Obviously, I don't think it is a roadblock in the end, but it's in the downward causation literature that tends to be one of the sort of poster children people come up with, along with the mind-body problem, as reasons why we can't have that reductive story.
Good. I'll think about that.
No, I'm sorry, Elias was sorry.
Yeah, I'm wondering what would you lose if you, instead of the picture that you presented, you have a picture in which you do have a growing block. Everything in the past is fully determined, but you have indeterministic laws, evolution laws. I think if you would get all the same benefits without being so controversial regarding dogmas. But I'm not sure, probably there's something that you think you would lose.
Okay, yeah, a couple of thoughts about that. One is that technically, as soon as I started putting these multiple branches in the past, it became an indeterministic picture in the sense that the current state of things does not any longer physically determine what's going to happen next. But it's not, what it isn't is a stochastic type of indeterminism. And I think that it's just unclear that stochastic indeterminism lets you have the determinate past and still have multiple branches. It doesn't make it any easier to tell the story about free will, I think. In some ways it makes it harder. But
probably I didn't understand how in your picture, you are able to answer those questions. I mean, it's like equally difficult in both cases, but probably.
Okay, maybe that's so. Certainly, nobody likes the idea that ultimately the only reason why my actions are open is because of their dependence on some quantum decays or some binding or non-binding of some little nucleotide here and there, which seems to be totally divorced from, say, conscious thoughts and intentions and things like that. That's the sense in which people see stochastic indeterminism as not helping.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So there were a couple of questions I wasn't completely clear about. It's something that seems strange to me is the way in which your intentions constrain the past events, so the ultimate reviews, in comparison with future ones. So if we want to admit free will, my intuitions regarding free will is that my intentions can make a big change in the future and not so much a big change in the past, which is what we were saying that. But at the fundamental level in this interaction, what justifies this analogy between past and future? That seems so related to what we haven't seen. So how do we have all those branches to the future but not so to the past? How intentions work as opposed to work there?
Well, on the second picture I was sketching, I mean, they just literally they get pruned out of reality, but the number towards the past is always the same as the number towards the future, because these are just like Bohmian trajectories. But the general reason why we have this ability to influence, I mean, I have nothing new to say about that. And I can't talk about it without using the word causation, unfortunately, but we can cause things to happen by moving our hands and stuff.
Maybe in terms of differences between the branches rather than number of branches was more appropriate. I don't know what you say.
Yeah.
Just a quick, sorry, joke, but it's a Western intuition that the future is open and the past is unchanging. If you're coming from a post-communist country, the future, which is fixed, and the past is constantly
Very good.
Okay, is there any other short questions or comments? Because we are already on some time. Okay, let's